Hey Book Dragons, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about why you should read The Dark Tower by Stephen King. So in April, I completed the final book of the Dark Tower series, The Dark Tower. And I absolutely loved this series. It had its high points and its low points, but overall I thought it was really, really excellently done. So I'm going to tell you today why I think that you should read the Dark Tower series. We're going to talk a little bit about the genre. We'll talk some about the characters. We'll talk about the overall plot. We'll talk about world building and themes and endings and all that good stuff. This is not going to be spoiler filled. I am going to give you a spoiler free review as much as possible. So stick with me here and we'll talk about all this fun stuff. And if you didn't notice, you may not have noticed, I am wearing my Dark Tower shirt, as you can see there. I am ready for this. So let's get to it. The first thing I want to talk about with the Dark Tower is genre. This is extremely important to understand for this series in particular, because it does not fall into just one genre. Most people label this fantasy, and it is. I think of it more in terms of speculative fiction as a whole. So speculative fiction includes a wide variety of different things under that umbrella. You've got fantasy, you've got sci-fi, you've got horror, you've got a whole bunch of different elements that fall under the umbrella of speculative fiction. And I think the Dark Tower series fits better in that umbrella because there are most definitely fantasy elements, no doubt about it. There is magic, there is witchcraft, there is lore, there is a whole bunch of different stuff that lends this to a fantasy epic. But it is also sci-fi. There is technology. There's ancient technology, robotics and different things like that. So I guess I would call this more of a dystopian sci-fi because it is happening after technology has kind of gone by the wayside, more or less. Robots are still kind of around in different places, but they don't really function properly or have a specific purpose anymore because the world has moved on. There are definitely horror elements to this. You've got portal fantasy popping up in here in a couple of books specifically. You've got romance. You got westerns. And I'm not a big fan of westerns, guys. I don't read westerns. But I like the Dark Tower. So there are so many genres wrapped up in here that it's hard to say that it fits in one specific genre. So keep that in mind when coming to the Dark Tower. If some of those genres I mentioned are not your favorites, you may find when you're reading the series that some parts of it are maybe not your cup of tea while others are. There are some really great characters in the Dark Tower series. So we're going to talk about some of the main characters. And there's lots of other side characters as well, guys. But I really want to talk about the main characters that you encounter over and over. And we're going to start with Roland Deschain. Roland Deschain is a gunslinger. He is the last of the gunslingers. He is one of the chief, if not the main gunslinger, like the granddaddy of the gunslingers, descended from the line of Arthur Eld. And Arthur Eld is King Arthur. Roland's six-shooters, his guns, are made from the metal of Excalibur, So he is a direct descendant. Well, in fact, the gunslingers as a whole, I believe, are direct descendants of the line of Arthur. And so that was a really cool like history and lore of the gunslingers to kind of learn about that whole thing. So and that's not a spoiler. That's something you learn early on. That Roland is descended from a line of knights. In fact, the poem that this is based on, or one of the poems, and I believe the specific poem that this line comes from was written by T.S. Eliot, and I might be wrong, and if I am wrong, I'm going to put right here on the screen who it, no, actually, I think it was William Browning. It was either T.S. Eliot or William Browning. I'm going to put it here on the screen for you. That way, there's no question about who it was. But it starts out, Child Roland to the Dark Tower came. And it's spelled Childe. So it's actually spelled differently. And it turns out that is an old term for knight. That's just some really cool lore. So, right there, it tells you that Roland is one of the knights, and he comes from a place called Gilead. And he's part of one of the baronies in Gilead, and all the gunslingers come from there, and they're well known for bringing peace and safety to the different baronies and the different countrysides that they encounter and helping people out. That's kind of what they're known for and what they do. So Roland is our main character in the story. There are other main characters, but he is the one who has the most buy-in to the story as a whole. We'll come back to him, because I will come back and talk about some of that stuff. Eddie Dean is another one. Now, Eddie Dean is from New York. He's from a more modern day New York. Think late 80s, early 90s. And he, when you first encounter Eddie, he's a drug pusher. And through special feats of magic, Roland and Eddie end up encountering each other. And I won't go into more details there because I want you to read it and experience it for yourselves. But Eddie ends up a close compadre of Roland in the story. There is another character that you encounter early on, and this is in book 1. We don't even see Eddie until book 2. But in book 1, you encounter a boy named Jake, who is extremely integral to the entire story. He encounters Roland early on in The Gunslinger, and at the very end of the first book, there is a rift that happens between him and Jake, and I won't say what it is. But then he has a chance to, or Roland has a chance to redeem himself with Jake later on in the story. It's really cool. So Jake is a really cool character. He's a young boy, also from New York, but he's from a little bit different time period of New York. There is Susanna, Detta Walker, Odetta Holmes, and she is a really interesting character. She's got several things that are affecting her life in negative ways. One of which is the fact that she is bound to a wheelchair because she lost the use of her legs, and you do find out why later on in the series, but not right away. So you'll actually later on in book 2 you do find out what happens and why she can't use her legs anymore, and so she's bound in a wheelchair. She also has dissociative identity disorder, so she has different pieces of herself that pop up at different points that have surfaced because of traumas. These things are negatively affecting her in life, but she eventually works through them, And later on in the story, she takes on the name of Susanna, so that's where we get the name Susanna from. So she is a magnificent character. She was drawn from an earlier period of time, I think 1950s, 60s, and she's black, so she already was looked down upon and frowned upon because of the color of her skin, and so she had that against her as well. And so becoming part of Roland's world was just a beautiful thing for her to be able to experience, because she finally had a place that she fit, where they didn't care about the color of her skin, and they were willing to take care of her and help her work through the different pieces of her identity and things that were vying for control in her. So Susanna is just a beautiful, amazing character. She's probably one of my favorite characters in the story. And she has one of my favorite stories to see her progress throughout the story. Just a brilliantly written character. I absolutely loved Susanna. And then there is a villain, and that would be the Man in Black. So one of the main verses in the Dark Tower is the Man in Black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. And so the gunslinger is chasing the Man in Black across the desert, especially in the first book, and they kind of come to this big confrontation. The Man in Black is a dark wizard, and he was the court magician for Roland's father. And eventually a bunch of different events happened in Roland's life that made him want to get revenge on the Man in Black. So just a super interesting character. We don't see a lot of him in the series. He pops up at different points under different names, and I'm not going to say what, because it will spoil some things, especially for other King books, and we're going to talk about the multiverse briefly here as well. But just know the Man in Black is a fascinating character for what little we get of him. So let's talk about the plot. It's a pretty simple plot for the most part. Roland is on his way to the Dark Tower. His plan is to arrive at the Dark Tower and right all the wrongs that have been done to him in his life, and all the wrongs that have been done to other people that he cares about. And along the way, he assembles a fellowship, if you will, of different people that are on the journey to the Dark Tower with him, and he's chasing the Man in Black, who also has a complicated relationship with the tower and with the Crimson King, who is a very mysterious figurehead in this story, a figurehead of evil. And eventually Roland is determined to get to the Dark Tower, overthrow the Crimson King, and right all the wrongs. So that's the basic overarching plot. But the plot in this series is a little bit hard to pin down, because every book has different subplots that feed into the main plot. So you could think of the main plot as kind of more of a sketch, and then all the other subplots kind of fill in different things in the story as you go along, which I thought was masterfully done. The plot was really, really well constructed. At times it was a little weird, and we'll talk about the weird, because if you've read Stephen King, you know about weird. We'll talk a little bit about that. But suffice it to say that the plot is Roland going to the Dark Tower, but along the way you've got a whole bunch of different subplots. You've got one book in particular, Wizard in Glass, gives a whole backstory on Roland when he was a young man, and a bunch of his other friends who were also trained to be gunslingers. and the different adventures that they had. So you get a lot of background into Roland himself, and that becomes a subplot of the larger Dark Tower plot. So it's all kind of woven together, and there is a very meta subplot as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean here in a little bit. Just like the plot depends on the book, the world building depends on the book as well. There are times that it is very clearly a Western, it is very clearly a fantasy. You've got magic sprinkled out through different points in the book. You've got witches, you've got magic orbs, which are very reminiscent of Lord of the Rings. In fact, I think it was a direct take from the Palantir from Lord of the Rings. So you got elements of that. You've got all the sci-fi elements, as I mentioned before. There are robotics and machinery and a crazy psychotic self-aware train or artificial intelligent train, I should say. You've got a post-apocalyptic element to it where there has been a major plague that wiped out a bunch of people in a different world. And that's the thing too. There's a lot of world hopping here. One of the main features of the Dark Tower is there are other worlds than these, and they go into some of these different worlds, and one of those worlds has had a cataclysm, a major plague that has wiped out the majority of the population, if not all of the population. So that is definitely something you need to be aware of, because you may want to do some side reading for this series, specifically The Stand. And if you know anything about The Stand, it involves a plague, and The Stand plays directly into the Dark Tower. It's on the path of the beam. So be aware that, if you read this series of books, you may have some spoilers for other King books, specifically The Stand and also Salem's Lot. Those are the two that play into it the most. So part of the world building in the Dark Tower is understanding the other worlds than these that play into the Dark Tower, specifically Salem's Lot and The Stand. There are others, but those are the two major players in the Dark Tower series. And you do encounter some other characters from those books as well. So keep in mind that you're going to have some characters spoiled as well. Or you're going to see some really cool Easter eggs from those other books if you've already read them. So it depends on what you want. You're going to encounter some characters, and it may be an Easter egg for you, or it may be a spoiler. So just be aware there is a recommended reading order for these books, and I will talk about that at the very end. I do want to touch on some of the subjects and the themes. And some of the subjects in particular may be triggering. The book deals very heavily with mental illness, dissociative identity disorder, racism, grief. There were times I was bawling, guys. I needed a tissue box for this series, because at times I was just beside myself with pain for the characters that you encounter. So a trigger warning for you is some of these subjects get really heavy, and they are done very, very well, but they are so detailed that it can be kind of heart-wrenching at times. There are some really great themes in this book series as well. Themes of love and friendship, companionship, loyalty, team building, loss. One of the major themes is destiny, because it flows throughout this whole book series. Destiny or fate is called Ka in this series, and you're always coming up against the will of Ka. If Ka wills it, it will be. So fate plays a huge role in this book series. There is some romance in the book, very heavily in book 4, Wizard and Glass. There is a lot of sexual content in that book specifically, and in a couple of the others. The Gunslinger has quite a bit of sexual content as well. So just be aware that there is that element to it. So if that bothers you, it's something to be aware of, okay? But there is a lot of sexual content. With respect to the theme of friendship, one of the most beautiful friendships in this book series is between Jake and Oi. Oi is his Billy Bumbler that he runs across. It's his pet, basically. Oi is a Billy Bumbler, and what that is it's kind of a cross between a beaver and a dog, and then he can parrot things back to you. So Oi does talk. So, you know, if you like animal companions and animal friendship, you're going to love Oi. He's an absolutely brilliant character. I loved Oi, and you're going to absolutely fall in love with him, I think. So now let's talk about some of the allusions. We already talked about Arthurian legend, so I'm not going to belabor that point. There is a very heavy element of Wizard of Oz in this book series. There is a very heavy element of The Lord of the Rings in this series. Stephen King has said that he wrote it as kind of his answer to Lord of the Rings. So, you know, the Dark Tower and the Crimson King and everything like that is very reminiscent of Sauron and the Tower of Mordor in Lord of the Rings. We already talked about the Seeing Stones, the Palantir, having an equivalent in the Dark Tower series. There's a whole bunch of name drops for different pop culture references, one of which is Wizard of Oz, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter makes an appearance in just general chatter and talk. So some of the names that things are given in the book allude to some of these different pop culture references. So that was kind of cool to see. Stephen King is really good about weaving those into the story. One of the things that was kind of weird, and we'll talk about the weird now, is as you get to that ending of the book series, it gets to be very meta. And what I mean about that is it's a very self-aware book to the point that Stephen King becomes a character at one point. That's all I'm going to say. If you know multiverses and you know it's very timey-wimey, you just may encounter the author at some point. I'm just saying. So keep that in mind. That part gets a little bit weird. In fact, at one point it gets very weird. It wasn't a bad weird though. I enjoyed it, but it was a little odd at first, especially in the Song of Susanna. Like at the very end of the book, you just got this whole section of just exposition by the author, and you're kind of not sure if like it's an epilogue or if it's actually happening in the story, and then it just abruptly ends. And then you're like, okay, I have to go read the final book now to find out what happens, because it just ends. And then there are two different endings. The very ending of the Dark Tower is not well loved by all the fans. I enjoyed it, but it's a very different ending. So before the actual ending, you do get an actual end. Like it's your kind of typical happy ending, so to speak. So you can stop with that ending and just never know. And in fact, at the end of the book, after he writes that ending, there's a coda from the author where he even says, hey, if you want to stop here, this is a great spot. If you want to know everything else, keep reading. You've been warned. So you get two different endings and you can kind of pick your ending, so to speak. I think that was a very brilliant way to do it, because I think that he knew that the actual final ending is going to be controversial. Overall, I absolutely loved this series. It had its hits, it had its misses, but the hits far outweighed the misses for me, and overall, it was just a smashing story. I highly recommend it to anyone who loves a very different fantasy epic. So it is 7 books, 8 if you count the novella that was written a few years after the last book. So there's 8 books in the series, including some extra reading, some extra credit reading if you want to read other books that play into the Dark Tower. The main book series of 8 books, I would recommend reading books 1 through 4, and then reading book 8, which is actually book 4.5, and then you can read 5, 6, and 7. If you want some of the extracurricular reading, like Salem's Lot and The Stand, I would highly recommend that you do that too. Then read The Stand, then read books 1 through 4, then read Salem's Lot, or book 4.5, The Wind Through the Keyhole, which was actually the last book written. You could read either that or Salem's Lot first, but you do need to read them both before you continue on into book 5, Wolves of the Kala, and then you can read Song of Susanna and the Dark Tower. And I would recommend reading the Song of Susanna and the Dark Tower back to back. I mostly did that. I took a short break in between, but I pretty much did that because, as I said, Song of Susanna just leaves you with a cliffhanger. So, yeah. So that is my recommended reading order. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Have you read this book series? What are your thoughts on it? I would love to know if you are more interested in reading this book now that I've made this video, if you've never read it before. Please let me know in the comments. I really hope you're as excited about this book series as I am. Make sure you are reading more books, and we will talk soon.